because they cannot be universal. Those questions are, and we can return to Aristotle, think about this through an Aristotelian lens, those questions are purely practical. And for Kant, practical wisdom is not pure reason, and therefore won't give us an absolute moral law, won't give us true morality. Practical concerns, as we said in the last lecture, are purely anthropological, they're purely social, and the social is, in essence, driven by self-interest. So, continuing on page 22, Kant says, if the means to happiness could be stated with certainty, this imperative of prudence, prudence being practical wisdom, would be an analytic practical proposition, for it would then differ from the imperative of skill. So, if the means to happiness could be stated with certainty, then it would be an analytic proposition. Now, what Kant is saying is we can never have certainty that our actions will in fact make us happy. That's evidence that we aren't using reason in order to decide what will make us happy, right? When something is truly rational, it is certain in the sense of mathematics or deductive logic. We want that degree of certainty. And he's saying, if we had that kind of certainty, then what makes us happy would be self-evident. What he means by analytic is that it is evident in itself, right? The certainty is undeniable. So what he has in mind is the kind of deductive logic that we use in logic, right? So all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Based on those two premises, the deductive conclusion is self-evident, right? Through reason. It produces certainty. There is no such certainty when we ask about what we need to do in order to achieve happiness. So, what possible moral laws could there be? Is there any kind of analytic truth about morality? Right? So this sets up one of the most important distinctions that Kant makes, which is the distinction between a hypothetical imperative and a categorical imperative. Right? And so if we had a blackboard, I would write up hypothetical and categorical imperative. The hypothetical imperative is anything that you do in order to achieve a practical goal. Anything you do as a means to an end. Right? So you come to class in order to be able to write your papers. Right? That's hypothetical. I do A because I imagine that it will give me the means to do B. We see this in Aristotle, right? When we're asking about what is good for the sake of something else versus what is good in itself. For Kant, what is good only as a means to something else is a much broader category than it is for Aristotle. Essentially, anything that we do in order to affect something happening in the realm of appearances, in the physical world, we do based on a hypothetical imperative. If I do something in order to achieve or accomplish or change something in the physical world, all of that is hypothetical. Right? It is a means to some end. Happiness itself, for Kant, is not an end in itself, not in a rational sense. For Kant, what is good in itself is reason alone, pure reason, and nothing but pure reason. Reason entirely removed from the practical sphere, the physical world. So the categorical imperative, which, as I said in the last video, is categorical because it applies to all people in all situations. Categorical imperative is that which is good in itself and which is analytically true. So what is an example of the categorical imperative? What's an example of the categorical imperative of this moral law that is true regardless of the circumstances? We have two forms of the categorical imperative that Kant explains, and we're going to walk through the first example, the first form of the categorical imperative, and give a few examples. On page 11, Kant articulates the first form of the categorical imperative. He says, "Since I have robbed the will of any impulses that could come to it from obeying any law, nothing remains to serve as a guiding principle of the will except conducts universally forming to law as such." All right, this is a very confusing formulation here. I've robbed the will of any impulses that could come to it from obeying any law. And by that, he means any particular law, right? Any particular law, for example, the principle of utility, right? Do what produces the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. That law is not going to be a truly moral law. It's not going to be an absolute moral law because it's going to be based on an evaluation of consequences in the physical world. Right? It's not going to be based in something that is certain and absolute. So any practical law like that, Kant has disavowed. Right? Except, he says, conducts universally conforming to law as such. Now, what he means by this is that you should not follow any practical law or any human law, but you have to follow, as it were, the law of the law that makes law possible, the possibility of universality itself. Right? You have to think about the form of law rather than a particular practical law, to think about what can logically and rationally be universalized rather than try to force some value that is going to be influenced by culture and historical circumstances, force some particular value to be the law. And this is the law as such, as Kant articulates it. He says, that is, I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maxim on which I act should be a universal law. Now, this is a poorly phrased sentence. This double negative is confusing. Right? He says, to paraphrase, I ought to act in such a way that I could will the maxim on which I act to be universal. Put more simply, Kant is saying that one has to do what is universalizable, that a moral action is one that you can will, that you would wish that all people at all times, in all places, in all circumstances, would do. Now, what is that? Right? What is an example of something that you could feasibly will everyone to do at every time? The most famous, the best example of this, which Kant discusses at some length in the groundwork, is the example of truth-telling versus lying. So what does he mean that truth-telling can be universalized and that I could will that truth-telling as a maxim be a universal law? And what does he mean that lying cannot be universalized, right? That it is impossible for lying to be universalized. The categorical imperative is based in what makes something a categorical imperative is that the structure of the act allows for it to be universalized. What is immoral to Kant is doing something that explicitly cannot rationally be universalized, that it is structurally impossible to universalize. And so the rational structure of the lie makes it impossible to universalize and therefore immoral. What does that mean? Well, we all grow up with a story about why this is true. And there's some philosophical debate as to whether or not it's useful to reduce these complicated philosophical ideas to children's stories. I tend to think it's useful. But bear in mind, this is not a one-to-one correlation. But the story of the boy who cried wolf gives us an example of why lying cannot be universalized. Right, what happens in the boy who cried wolf? I can't remember exactly how it goes, right? There's a wolf outside. Oh man, they're gonna end us in 10 minutes. We'll see what happens. There's a wolf outside. The boy there is no wolf outside, but the boy tells his parents that there is a wolf, right? The parents get their guns and go off hunting for the wolf, and it turns out there is no wolf. The boy repeats this over and over again, and the parents eventually stop believing